Maybe each of you can take a moment to introduce yourself, name, title, your organization, and anything specific you want the audience to know about you.
Can I start this?
Yeah, Peter. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Peter Kleinhenz. I'm a general partner in a firm called CID Venture Partners and also a venture partner in a firm called Fletcher Spaght. I've been a venture capitalist for 15 years, working in medical device diagnostics and healthcare services. Prior to being a venture capitalist, I spent about 10 years as an entrepreneur, owning an engineering firm that did medical product development, and also the CFO of a startup biotech and medical device company.
Don Hubbard, Vice President of Sales and Marketing with Checkpoint Surgical.
Stephanie.
Harrington, CEO, Matrix Medical Devices.
Marilyn, Denegre-Rumbin, Director of Payor-Reimbursement Strategies for Cardinal Health.
I'm Julia Darden. I'm the branding director and managing partner for DardenLentz, which is a branding and marketing agency that specializes in healthcare.
So let's kick it off with just the general question. Of all the things we talked about in commercialization planning, I mean, are there some aspects that are more important to cover than others? I mean, is there a good example of one that was well done and maybe an example of one that probably missed some important part? Have you gone through a process where you found that you missed something in your commercialization planning, and then you had to come back and then revisit it and correct it and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it is not uncommon. I mean, when you're taking a company, out for the first time, to not envision every way the customer is going to utilize your product or even like your product. It's not uncommon to think something will be important that isn't, when things that are important that you didn't visualize. So you sometimes have to go back in and change your messaging, kind of tailored around what the customer is telling you is valuable to them.
Right. Peter, from all
Sure.
the companies you invested in, do you
Sure,
have some thoughts?
I've had, I've had, in the last few years, I've done 12 investments and I've had 6 really good exits. Of the companies that didn't exit well, it's usually a failure in our, at least for me as an investor, a failure in my due diligence process in understanding what they were really doing. And because of that failure, I missed out some part of a sales or a marketing. It's usually not a clinical issue, really, although I'm sure there probably could be, but it's some hiccup in my thinking about how we approach the marketplace and how fast we could get into the marketplace, and were we really ready to be in the marketplace. And I can recall a few companies where we corrected it and we brought in new management and they were able to say, we really don't know what we're selling. We need to step back. And in that case, you have to hope your syndicate and the rest of the team has enough dry powder to restart, essentially. But the planning we've talked about today is really essential planning, and it's the kind of business planning that everyone has to go through and be ready to correct.
Anything, Stephanie? Marilyn? Yeah.
I have seen, from my perspective, that where device companies have failed is that actually the failure of incorporating reimbursement in the pre-planning stages. Even with mature products, I find that I spend a lot of time, when I call Reimbursement 101, educating those within the company, if it's a product manager, if it's sales, if it's someone clinical or regulatory, having them understand the building blocks of reimbursement and how critical it is and how integrated it is in the process, from pre-commercialization through market launch to even when the product is mature, the changes that are happening in the marketplace. But I see where that has been a failure. Many times I've been called when I've done consulting, and they'll have a product in the market 2 or 3 years, and they actually didn't incorporate what they needed to for their reimbursement strategy. So they've lost momentum, they're discouraged. And what has happened too is if they didn't incorporate it, many times they're not able to get the reimbursement they might have if they had pre-planned it, if they incorporated it with the regulatory and clinical, that we could have gotten higher reimbursement. And actually probably with your KOLs that they would have been more receptive to doing this, knowing that they were actually going to be reimbursed, profitably.
I go back to Don's presentation in the last session. I think the true test is
if you can have a salesperson articulate the message and the value proposition in 30 seconds, well, then there is a lot of hope. If it's too complicated, if it's too complex, if the regulatory challenges, don't allow them to say the words that they need to say. I mean, it's kind of a good test. Proof is in the pudding. If you can't get up there and say it, then that's where I've seen companies really struggle.
Crisp value proposition.
I think you're both kind of right. I've seen it in a company I'm thinking about. We had a wound care product, and in a wound care product company, no one really owns wound care. There's a number of specialists, and it's a good example of what reimbursement and sales, there's huge challenges. And it really does drive home the point that you have to align from your beginning of your plans, clinical, regulatory. I would also say IP is also important in the world, because we haven't really touched on that. But reimbursement, those are all like the three legs of the stool nowadays that you have to work on.
Any thoughts?
Well, I'd certainly agree with Stephanie. I think oftentimes we find that our customers will have a really complex UVP. And it needs to be something, if your customer's going to remember what your unique value proposition is, it has to be something that you position in a way that is memorable to them and is meaningful to them. And I think you have to do the same thing internally. Everybody on your team has to be able to quickly articulate that, and it has to be something that is memorable, repeatable, and credible. It has to be really align with their experience with the product. It can't just be wishful thinking.
Switching gears, Peter, you invest in several startup companies. Given that most of the startups typically are very, very cash-strapped for resources, are they, and then eventually actually depend on a strategic partner or something for marketing and sales, and at least expect to, many of them. Are there key aspects that you still want them to invest in terms of all the commercialization, especially the sales and marketing side? What are investors looking for in terms of what level of
solely on commercialization
built,
or just in general? When I start and approach a company, there's this old saying about the horse, the rider, and the race. Those are key aspects that I look at, and it's how big is the market? What's the management team like, and what's your advantage, and is it sustainable? And if it has those three elements, then I'm interested in looking more at this. And if you have a management team that knows what they're doing, they're going to have a good plan together. And what I have to do in my due diligence is figure out whether their key plan really holds the water when I talk to customers, and I talk to strategics too. So most of the time, the companies I invest in are companies that are going to be sold to strategics, because the IPO market really hasn't been open for medical device companies. It's true in biotech, but not in medical devices. So I even go to strategics in my due diligence process and test concepts with them about companies I'm thinking of investing.
And then what are the strategics typically looking for in a startup, and in terms of?
I'd say they're not looking so much for a startup, but they're looking at what they want to acquire as a company, depending upon the market you're in. And I sold two companies this year, and one was a $55 million a year company in revenue, and I invested in that at $3 million, and it grew. But it had the appropriate amount of revenue. It had the margins that were necessary in a medical device. It had a proven recipe, obviously. If you're at $55 million of revenue and you've grown from 3, you know how to sell your product. And it would fit in with what that particular strategic company wanted. They had a direct sales force, and we used direct sales force. The other company that I sold was around $22 million revenue in company. That company, orthopedic company, used a lot of distributors, and that's how historically a lot of products have been sold. And it fit in with the model that people in the orthopedic space wanted. Another company I sold, that company, we used direct sales force, and it was a diagnostic company. So you have to sort of mold your company with what industry they're in, and what revenue hurdle rate would be material to a company. The company that, both of the last 2 sale companies, they were major medical product companies. One's ConMed, and the other one is Zimmer Biomet. And so you have to have enough sales revenue to be material for a company like that. So those are all the things that you sign up to juggle. But you really do, as the old saying goes, start with the end in mind. You do think about, when you're an investor, how am I going to get out of it? Because I need to give my investors back their money and then some. So.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so listening to everything that Peter says, I mean, as the inventor, as a startup company, that's why you want people like Peter. So, you know, what money you choose to have, it's not just the investment, it's the people around the table, your board, and, you know, who are going to provide you guidance and networks that is equally
that is all
important.
Part of it. All money is green, and hopefully we distinguish ourselves as good investors because we bring our experience. I mean, it's having done a lot of deals, but also being an operator. That's a big advantage as an investor. And if this is just, can I digress?
Yes.
If you're looking for money, you should interview that investor as much as you would interview an employee. Don't come into the idea that they're doing you a favor investing in you. You have every right to ask, well, tell me what kind of style it is that's successful for you. Tell me the other deals. Interview other people who have been, that person has invested in, to find out what kind of person that investor is in on your board, and what other things, you know, the so-called value add. I mean, figure out what you need, and also be willing to, you know, to investigate that person.
I would say that, you know, again, one of the things strategics are looking for, and I've had a lot of conversation with strategics, they're looking for something that they can put into the bag of their sales force, whether it's direct or indirect, take out the cost associated with the company and immediately improve margins. At the end of the day, that's the thing they're predominantly interested in. You know, the numbers Peter quoted are very much in line with, you know, many takeouts, right, in that $20 to $50 million, sometimes earlier, depending on how much capital you've already got in the game. You know, what do you have to get for a return so that to satisfy the investors you already have? But it is incumbent once, that was the point I made in my presentation, once you commercialize, you're measured on results. Now, it could be that you're able to say, look what I was able to do with one hospital in one market, and then extrapolate that. It could be, you know, a small footprint sales team that you can say, look, we're resource limited, but look what we did in Cleveland, Ohio. Imagine now what we could do if we had the sales resources of one of the big, you know, strategics, and push that across the country. So it's not like that you have to demonstrate the ability to do it from sea to shining sea, but you do have to demonstrate the ability to do it at some level somewhere to make it strategic interested. What's interesting is in the case of our technology, because it is very different than what's currently employed, the conversations we've had with strategic today say, really interested in your product. It is really, really cool. Go prove people will buy it.
Yeah.
And go prove that people will, that you can convert, because quite honestly, I'm competing with them. My technology is competing with the very people we would like to buy it, you know, have purchased it from, and they say, prove it. Prove that you can go head up with us and win. And if so, then come back to our table.
Yeah, you have to have a proven sales model. Yeah. And you should talk to that by your investor too. When you're talking to your investor about what is it, you know, investors want to exit, so talk about the likely exit scenarios. Exactly. To the extent that you know, if you're really early, you should at least know, here's kind of our game plan and our goal. And you look at that every year as you go in to your annual planning with the investor.
And I mean, I think the model has changed, right? So I mean, all these strategic partners have merged. There's less and less of them, and they're waiting. I mean, they can wait to you show 50 million or 100 million in revenue, and so, you know, that 3 to 4 year return on investment in the medical device industry has changed, and it is now. I mean, and so as you know, if you're very early stage, there is a long road, and just to be prepared for that. So
it's hard to get
it's
money.
It's a fun
now.
road, but
yeah, it is a long road.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit. What is the right role for a marketing and branding agency like we talked about earlier, versus having internal hires to do some of that work? And what situation is one better than the other, and how does that work together? John, you want to take a shot at that?
I don't think there's a one better than the other. I mean, it depends on how often you need it. I mean, I think professionals are certainly people that you avail yourself in when you're new and you don't necessarily have the internal need for it. I mean, I recently hired a director of marketing internally in their 4th year of commercialization, because up to that point, our needs were so sporadic, I would outsource because that made more sense. didn't have a constant need of it, but as it became more apparent that I needed to avail myself of that more frequently, it made more sense financially to bring it in-house. But I don't think that's different than HR or accounting or any other functionality that a company needs to survive. When you're small, you're resource constrained, and so you try to buy as little as you can because it's cost, it's not revenue, to get the job done. And I think in those scenarios, certainly it makes all the sense in the world to outsource. And it may be, if you've got a good strategic partner, you stay with it indefinitely. I don't think there's a right or wrong to this answer. I think it's what's best for your firm.
I see it, Barry. I'm sorry.
I was actually going to say, so I have an early stage client who was actually here in the presentation earlier, and during the break we were talking about Jacqueline's presentation, and what I saw as something that he needed to better understand was what are the best avenues for marketing and sales, and so organizations like Jacqueline's are exactly those types of tools and resources that can help provide that, because those are not easy decisions, direct versus indirect and all,
I think it depends too on the strength of your management team.
Yes.
I have a reagent company up in Ann Arbor that I'm working hard on. It's my last portfolio company, and it's run by a bunch of smart technologists, but they don't have any clue really on branding, and they need expertise. We get into these debates at the boardroom about the website doesn't really reflect what we think it ought to. When I was listening to the presentation earlier about websites and everything, going, man, my guys could really use help on this, because they argue with us and they say, you don't understand who our customers are, and we're saying it's not just your customers, it's who's going to buy the company, it's a whole group of people that branding and your website are all involved in. So I think.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt,
No.
but I think selecting the right firm for you, or the mix of services that you want to buy out, it's kind of similar to what Don talked about when he was talking about looking at a sales force. And I think the first thing you need to do is assess your management team, assess where your weaknesses are, where your gaps are, where do you need assistance. Do you have a really strong sales guy in charge of your organization? So do you need someone who has a lot more experience on marketing strategy? Do you have a great marketing strategist in place, but you don't have anybody who knows, for example, how to put sales training materials together? You need help with that, in addition to all of the other functions that a branding agency does. So I think assessing what your gaps are and finding an organization that can fill those is really important. I think it's also important, even when you have certain capabilities in-house, that you consider that your agency can bring an objective perspective to things that you maybe can't, because you've maybe been with the company for 3 years. Sorry, this is your baby. It doesn't have a lot of freckles, a lot of scars, a lot of wrinkles, but they're going to see those. And that's really important if you're going to get to what we talked about earlier, getting to a UVP that's credible. It can't be about what you want the product to be about. It's got to be about what the customer's really going to see. And sometimes you need that objectivity to do that.
I will tell you that the biggest, it's funny, 4 different firms, one of the biggest challenges is getting senior management to recognize that they're not good at marketing.
Yeah.
Because I have never met a human being that doesn't have an opinion about marketing and think it's easy. And I use the analogy, I said, you ever gone to someone's house and it's decorated and you're like, ooh, you're like, whoa, my God. Or you've seen someone dressed in a way that you went, really? They thought it looked good. They did not wake up and go, I'm going to look hideous today. They went in the mirror and went, nailed it. And so that same person has an opinion on your brochure, right? So it is impossible to convince somebody their taste is bad, because we all thought it was good when we got dressed, painted our house, did whatever. So I have never worked with a CEO, I've never worked with a director of finance, I've never worked with anybody that went, I just don't have I'm not good at this. They all think they're good at it. So it is really challenging to convince people to go, like you said with that firm, the engineering firm, to go, you didn't nail it.
It's a challenge, exactly. And I was going to say the flip answer is, well, you should go to some of your investors and say, hey, we're having problems. But I'm an investor, and I'm chairman of the board of this company, and I'm managing this conflict between another investor and the CEO, and not making a lot of progress on convincing this technical CEO. But it's my job, and I've got to keep on working on it. But I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I actually admit that I don't know much about that. I will say
You're the
that.
rarity.
No, I don't know. I'm just I'm a
No,
finance
it's
person.
a specialty. It
I'm a finance-
actually is.
Yeah.
And there's that primary research in marketing, the secondary research that they pull together, and there's visual. There's just so many attributes that actually go into marketing. I would agree. I know I'm not a marketing person, but I can appreciate the talent that
Yes.
they bring
I agree.
to the finishing of getting that product to market. But to answer the question too, just to reiterate actually what everybody else, I've seen it marketing where actually even in large companies, they could have a great marketing staff, but they actually need somebody to come in because they need a new set of eyes.
Mm-hmm.
They need somebody even sometimes to take the group, the product managers, the marketing managers, bring them together and bring in a fresh look or consolidation, to make it more cohesive and then drive a product. But then again, I've done startups where they didn't have a marketing department. They had to have someone from the outside come in. So it just depends on the need.
And I think you bring up two really important issues. We're talking mostly about what the role is of the agency, but internally there's a really important role that sometimes gets missed in a startup. You bring in the agency and you say, okay, we want you to do all of these things, but you don't give them somebody on the inside who's going to hold them accountable and make sure that they get the resources from within the company that they need in order to do their job well. And so a lot of times if you don't have somebody inside who takes that ownership, the agency is doomed before they start. And I think the second thing that you brought up that was a really good point is that a lot of times what the agency can help you do is to get alignment within the organization. And so one tactic that we use is when we need to get alignment on the UVP before we start a branding process, we get a cross-functional team together for a workshop. It's global if it needs to be. And you get them all together, you create a series of exercises so everybody's contributing their expertise that comes from different disciplines and pull that together to get the UVP. And then we go away and we base the positioning on that. So, but it's all rooted in what the team contributes. So we find we get a lot more alignment that way.
I'm going to switch topics again a little bit, and we talked a lot about selling and marketing to the hospital or the provider, and a little bit to physicians. What about marketing to payers itself? I mean, and are there key things to think about?
Yes, actually,
really
the dynamics have changed the last few years with payers. We approaching them from medical device companies, we are barbarians at the gate. They really don't want to talk to us. At one time, you could have a company come in and you could have a dialogue. You'd meet with their medical directors. You'd show them what your product is, what the attributes are, where you figure you're targeting a disease state. But right now, they're really not interested. They are tremendously challenged with managing dollars and the challenges coming in from Washington with the Affordable Care Act. And employer groups are becoming questionable too. They're having to insure things they didn't plan on. They could have populations that are saying, one time I didn't have to provide this. This was actually something that was a choice that they would pay for out of pocket. New technologies are very expensive to roll into premium dollars today. So payers are really not interested in enrolling that. And if anything, there's a lot of contraction with payers with even medical devices. What they're really looking for is, with that contraction, is we'll even take a segment. Let's say it's wound care. They might look for one provider. Let's say I'll just say Humana. Mm-hmm. Let's say Humana wants just one provider to handle all of wound care. That's it. That's all they want to deal with. They're going to have their pricing. You're going to have your distribution in place. And what happens to the others who actually have products? And what happens to the consumer that they no longer have choice? This is it. This is what you're going to get. So that's why I'm saying the market has changed dramatically. I would say 10, 15 years ago, new technology had more of an opportunity, and consumers had more choices. We have more choices today. It's just that they're not accessible.
Other thoughts around payers?
No clue.
You don't have to. Yeah,
No
you don't
clue
market much
whatsoever.
at all.
I'm listening and trying. Like, okay.
Yeah.
We
Well, I
thought
think it
you-
helps. It helps to understand why there's a dynamic. You know, one of the things that the architects of the Affordable Care Act is that they actually forewarned you, is that they were going to contract the market. And so one of the things that was going to happen is in that contraction is you'll see a lot of consolidation. We see consolidation with payers, you know, all the mergers and acquisitions, and you're seeing large payers merging, becoming oligarchies. You know, they're almost too big. But they're also trying to find space in the market, who they can capture, what those demographics are. In addition, you're seeing companies doing the same thing. You're seeing major companies gobbling up to figure out what they're going to build within their arsenal, so to speak. So if you're a J&J and if you're looking at one segment, in fact, J&J is actually a good model to see how they actually take technology that's already developed. They use it, it's a cash cow for a while, but the minute they know there's a change in reimbursement or they've reached their ROI, they divest. Okay, so somebody else is building maybe a portfolio in that segment, whether it's orthopedics or cardiology or wound care. You'll see all of a sudden another company figure out, I need that gives me a larger portfolio for my sales team. So you'll see that as well. But the challenge is in reimbursement, because it's actually shrinking. It's contracted, it's more difficult, especially I think for physicians. Primary care, I don't know how they'll ever pay off their school loans, because their income is, and think about it, we actually pay plumbers and electricians sometimes more than what we would actually pay, you know, a physician who has that skill. He has your life in his hands, but we're challenging them all the time. We don't get to negotiate with electricians and plumbers, right?
Yeah. Not usually,
But
that's
here
a
we
great-
go,
that's a great
right?
model,
Well,
yeah.
here, if you know, I have a friend who's in primary care. She told me that after she renegotiated all of her contracts, and then she's actually making less now than she did in 15 years, and yet her staff, she's had to increase their pay. And she says, how do I do that? I'm working longer and harder and making less money, and they're responsible for episodes of care, not just a visit anymore. So it is a challenge. I think that, and we need to consider that. Actually, when you're looking at your product, you actually have to look at, you know, your points of service. Is it hospital? Is it outpatient? Is it long-term care? And you're going to see a lot of activity in post-acute care. That's actually where the market is moving to. So keep that in mind, where your point of service is, where the direction is, because as you're creating your product, where is it going to be? Where's your demographics? You know, and then economically, those demographics make a difference. We're in consumer-driven health plans now, so some people have high deductibles, as much as $12,000. So now, you know, you figure you're paying $12,000 in premiums, you're paying $12,000 a deductible. That's $24,000 out of pocket, and you haven't gotten health care yet. So what you're going to see too, and this is my opinion though, I think you're going to see this seesaw, where we've taken care of all of the uninsured. They're getting well taken care of, and healthcare costs are through the roof because they weren't maintaining their health. Those of us who had maintained our health now can't access it because of cost. We think twice. I better not go to the doctors. I'm not going to do the preventive. You know, that's a lot of money out of my pocket. So you're going to see those people becoming ill. And so you're going to see, again, increases in reimbursement.
Maybe just a
cost.
few add-on points. I mean, so one is maybe the biggest takeaway from today is just know what you know and know what you don't know. Because expertise like this in marketing is, I mean, just knowing when to call somebody to help, whether it's regulatory or reimbursement or marketing. But I also think all these dynamics are changing, and it's going to be a little bit of a struggle here. And I think my trend, what I'm seeing is, just building on what you said, is a lot of moving to the home. And so from a regulatory standpoint, moving medical devices to the home, it has a whole different layer of complexity and risk aversion. And so getting those products to the home are that much harder from an FDA standpoint. So, but that's where the opportunities are. I
Right.
truly see, I agree with you.
Any other thoughts? Again, shifting gears a little bit, we talked a lot about marketing channels, and we saw a few of them. Are there certain marketing channels that are kind of more effective in terms of marketing to hospitals? And Julia, you want to take that?
Yeah, well, and I think we go back to one of the themes for today, which is,
Independence, yeah.
you're not marketing to a hospital, you're
Yeah.
marketing to a
Yep,
person.
yep.
And so I think there's a vast difference depending on who you're marketing to in the hospital. Not just whether you're marketing to a physician or whether you're marketing to somebody in purchasing, but even between physicians. There are very different channels that work for all of them. I think we all find that conferences are very effective across the board, and making sure to address those conferences in a very fulsome way. You don't just show up with your little pop-up booth, but you make sure to do everything around it to build traffic. You make sure to have sponsorships. You make sure to do everything you can to maximize that conference. But beyond that, what are the other ways that that you can reach your target market? I think you have to. It goes a bit to persona. We've talked about that. You need to really know how your physicians, if that's who you're targeting, how they want to be reached. If it's a pathologist, it's going to be very different than if it's a surgeon. A pathologist is probably going to respond well to email because he or she is in their office, they're at their computer. The surgeon doesn't want to touch it. So you need to look at what they're going to respond to. And I think one thing that we don't want to do, if you have to look at what the purpose is of a particular advertising promotion. If it's for lead generation, well, you probably don't want to use journal ads. But journal ads, whether they're online or whether they're in print, are still really effective ways to maintain brand or to establish brand. And so you don't want to ignore that, even though we all like to talk about the fact that print is dead. It's really important not to ignore that.
Other thoughts?
I would just say, I agree. I guess I'd say I know what doesn't work. I don't know necessarily. I agree completely on the conferences because you have face-to-face contact with a channel, a surgeon that I like to describe as only marginally more difficult to get in front of than the President of the United States in terms of the gatekeepers that exist. So from our perspective, conferences are fantastic ways of getting this close to somebody that otherwise is a real challenge to get in front of. But I'll tell you what doesn't work. What doesn't work is anything that looks, smells, or tastes like an ad. If it looks like you're selling something, they get rejected en masse. So what we've had a lot of success with is presenting clinical information to a surgeon, or in the case of my gatekeepers, economic information that presents us as an alternative or a choice to what they're currently doing. But really, almost like, we're sorry, but here's some information you might want to consider, as opposed to an in your face, you should buy it. That gets inside of a hospital, the constituency groups, whether it's a doctor or an OR director or a material manager, I don't care who it is, they are really hardwired to reject that. So at least my experience has been it's got to be presenting information for their consideration that will lead them down the path of a choice to your product.
I think you're exactly right. I think that's something that, on the one hand, is an outgrowth of the situation that we have in healthcare today. But I also think that that's something that grows out of a change we see across our society in general. We have this society now where information is a currency. And so there's an exchange that happens. People are willing to give you time, or they're willing to give you their contact information if you're going to give them something of value. And that's, again, when it comes, your understanding of who your customer is comes into play. Figuring out what information is going to be valuable to that person and making that available to them.
And I've sort of just found that putting two at the same level seems to work much better. So, you know, typically I strongly recommend medical directors. I mean, and you know, if it needs, I mean, you need to use whatever assets will help best, you know, deliver the message. And so typically, you know, for whatever reason, doctor to doctor seems to work much better.
Oh, yeah, it does.
I want to comment one thing because I know there are a lot of entrepreneurs here. This past year, we've had an opportunity through another organization actually where, I don't know if you're aware of, the FDA does a monthly program on certain segments. So it could be orthopedics, it could be wound care. And I'm going to tell you, they love for them to actually have you come in and demonstrate your product. Because what happens for your 510K is they see it, they hear it, you have your champions, and they have the schematics and the engineering of your product, but they've never had real hands-on. So I've actually brought medical directors or physicians, surgeons in for certain products, and then people within the FDA, depending on that segment, will come and try, taste, you know, smell the whole thing, and then they'll rate your product among themselves as to, wow, that was, you know, that really worked. In other words, let's say it's screws and rods in orthopedics, and they have a chance to actually use a drill, you know, way a surgeon would drill, or use it. They're really entranced with seeing that technology and the technology that you also get to see that's in the pipeline, because people will bring it for you to come and see it. But it's a great opportunity to see what your competitors are doing. It's a great way of seeing what technology is out there and getting a hands-on. So keep that in mind.